So you've said
Mm,
before that you did not consider yourself a writer,
mm-mm.
and yet here you are.
Yeah,
So, first of all, do you consider yourself a writer yet?
Yeah, I guess I do. I mean, I've been doing this now for 30 years, 31 years. And I don't think I'm qualified to do anything else at this point. And plus I love what I do. So, it's kind of you like what you're doing, you look forward to the next chapter or next book. Met some lovely people along the way, both authors and readers. So it's all good, I think. Yeah, I guess I do consider myself a writer now. Yeah.
Do you have a sense, was that like within the last 5 years or the last 20 years or?
I don't know. After the first book, excuse me, they kept sending me contracts. I kept sending them books. They kept sending me more contracts. I kept sending them more books. So now 30 years later, we're still doing that. So, I guess I don't know. My girlfriends often tell me that I have no sense of my impact
Hmm.
on the genre because I'm just writing kissing books, right? You know, I'm I'm not trying to I'm trying to write the stories that I would have loved to read growing up
Mm-hmm.
because there was nothing in the marketplace that reflected me or looked like me or, my mom or my sisters. And I'm just trying to write books. Toni Morrison's got that quote. I know I'm going to mess it up, but she said that, if there's a book out there that you want to read that isn't out there, then you need to write it.
Yeah.
So that's how I feel. And I guess, a lot of accolades along the way. And I try not to pay any attention to that. Because, your heads get so big, you can't get through the door. Uh, but to be known for writing good stories, I think that's all I really want out of
Mm-hmm.
this whole quote unquote legendary life.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, who were some of were you reading romance before you started writing romance?
Yeah, I mean, I read everything. I mean, there was really no quote unquote designated romance when I was coming up. You had Mary Stewart, you had Victoria Holt, you had who else? I also read Louis L'Amour and I read, Shakespeare and I read, Sherlock Holmes and I read, everything, I'm one and I've told this story before. I'm one of those kids that read everything in my neighborhood library, from the kiddie books to the adult books. So romance as a pre-genre, because that's really what it was back then, was just one of the many, many, many things that I read. But I'd always loved a good love story. I mean, there on the screen, like I said, nothing in print. But my sisters and I, we loved the Rock Hudson and the Doris Day movies and James Garner and all of that. And we had romance in our lives with our parents and our aunts and our uncles and we all, if you go to church, you have that little old couple that's been married for 50 years who is still holding hands coming out of the church, going across the parking lot to their car to go home for dinner. So, the romance is there, even though it wasn't reflected in the major culture. So,
Yeah. And
yeah.
did you write your first manuscript thinking, I'm going to sit down and write a kissing book? Or were you writing a story that you found interesting and then found a publisher who
I
wanted a
was
kissing book?
I was writing strictly for me because this was God. I think I started Night Song back in the 70s.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah. I'm an old lady. And this was BC before children. And so my husband, who played tennis in high school, he was a printer back then when we first got together. So he would come home from work, wash off the ink and go play tennis. And I was working at the Michigan State University Library in the graduate library. So I could go down to cataloging and grab, whatever was on a card as long as I brought it back and it wasn't dirty or cleaned or, wasn't dropped in the mud or whatever.
Yeah.
So I would come home and read and write. working on this story for me. So fast forward about maybe 10 years, 15 years. I was working for Park Davis Pharmaceuticals in their library, and one of my colleagues had just written a sweet romance, and she had just gotten that published. We were celebrating her. I was telling her about this little romance that I was working on, and she said, bring it in. I've told this story 1,000 times. Um, bring it in. She looked at it. She said, I needed to get it published. And, this is before the market was closed. I'm like, where? Where am I going to get this published? So I tell people she, harassed me every day. Find you an agent, find blah, blah, blah. So some kind of way I found Vivian Stevens. I have no idea how I found Vivian. She's my first agent. She had gotten out of publishing. And I sent her my little raggedy manuscript. And she called me less than a week later, said she wanted to represent me. And then like 1,000 rejections later, Ellen Edwards at Avon bought the book on my husband's birthday. Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah, I told the story. I told the story at one of the RW. We were having a hell of a fight that day. I mean, I don't know what we were fighting about. We were fighting up and down the steps and the necks rocking and all of that. And the phone rang. And it was Ellen. And she said she wanted to buy my book. So time out on the fight, and my husband said, I guess I got to take your little butt to dinner. I said, yes, you do. So then it was published a year later, which was Night Song, my first book. So it was the summer of Black Love, because that was also the summer that Arabesque published their first African-American contemporaries
Hmm.
with Betty Ford and Donna Hill and those ladies. But I was the only one doing historicals. So now, what, 30 years later, I'm still, but then I've been in a lot of sandboxes. I've been blessed to have a publisher that trusts my writing.
Hmm.
So historical, I've done contemporaries, I've done YA, women's fiction. I'm glad that I was not just relegated to one box, one sandbox.